Deacon calls out Taylor's name while in bed with Sheila. The bold and the beautiful spoilers allude that Deacon Sharp could make a horrible boob and put Taylor Hayes in grave danger. However, it could absolutely rankle Sheila Sharp if Deacon makes a big mistake at the worst possible moment. Sheila lately tried to move Cleric to have a romantic evening with her, but he pumped the thickets by pretending he was coming down with commodity. Although Sheila gave Deacon a pass that one time, he can't keep making defenses ever. At some point, Cleric will moreover have to advertise he's leaving Sheila or just accept this as his life. Although Deacon doesn't love Sheila the way he loves Taylor, he still cares about his woman and doesn't want to shoot her off the rails. It's true that Deacon's kiddies doen't authorize of his current marriage, but jilting Sheila could end in disaster. Indeed, if Deacon were to leave out the part about his passions for Taylor, decoupling Sheila could still beget all kinds of drama, since Cleric can't be with Taylor anyway. At least not right now. We could imagine him trying to make it work with Sheila. Cleric might decide his marriage to Sheila will have to be good enough and hope that perhaps his love for her will grow again. It's egregious that Sheila is eager to get Deacon back in bed. The two of them used to slightly be suitable to keep their hands off each other, so Deacon can't keep pushing Sheila down without raising reservations. Plus, Deacon will be feeling awfully lonely and blue without Taylor in the coming B&B occurrences. It's easy to imagine Deacon surrendering to a hot night with Sheila in an attempt to find some comfort. Cleric might indeed find himself featuring about Taylor while hitting the waists with Sheila, which could be a form for disaster. What if Deacon calls out Taylor's name during some sizzling Sheila bedroom time? Everyone's been eager to see how Sheila will find out about Deacon's passions for Taylor, so this would be an intriguing way to go. Sheila would incontinently know who's really been on Deacon's mind and in his heart. Cleric might scramble to explain and call it a slip of the lingo, but Sheila would be mealy and presumably would end by that for a alternate. This could lead to Sheila forcing the whole verity out of Cleric and blow effects up between them in a big way. Whatever the case, the bold and the beautiful spoilers say Sheila and Deacon are headed for a marriage catastrophe sooner or laterly, so stay tuned for any terrible news to come. The night air around the small sand house felt heavier than usual, thick with implied trueness and the kind of craving that refused to fade still into the dark, and outside, Deacon Sharp sat alone at the edge of his unmade bed, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together as though he were soliciting for clarity he knew might no way come, because loving two women in two veritably different ways had sculpted him into someone he slightly honored presently, and as much as he tried to move himself that marrying Sheila had been a bold step toward stability, toward fidelity, toward proving to the world that indeed two damaged souls could make commodity steady, the verity was that his heart had shifted the moment Taylor Hayes walked back into his route with her calm strength and compassionate eyes that sounded to see the better man he wanted to be. He told himself over and over that what he felt for Taylor was admiration, gratefulness, perhaps indeed a transitory crush born from vulnerability, but every time her name surfaced in his studies, it dallied longer than it should, echoing in the quiet spaces of his mind until it came insolvable to ignore, and meanwhile Sheila, perceptive in her own razor-sharp way, had begun to smell the distance growing between them, the subtle hesitance in his touch, the distracted look in his eyes whenever she spoke about their future as though it were written in endless essay rather of fragile chalk. She had tried to reignite the spark that formerly burned so hectically between them, suggesting romantic feasts, soft music, indeed sportful teasing that formerly would have had Cleric beaming from observance to observance, but recently he'd been dodging her advances with flimsy defenses about stress or fatigue, and though she laughed them off at first, a flicker of dubitation had begun to hint beneath her rehearsed countenance, because Sheila Sharp was numerous effects. Passionate, violent, fiercely devoted but unconscious was no way one of them. Still, Deacon knew he couldn't keep pushing her down without consequences, and on a particularly lonely evening when recollections of Taylor's gentle stimulant replayed in his head like a song stuck on reprise, he set up himself giving in to the comfort Sheila offered, telling himself that perhaps if he leaned completely back into his marriage, the confusion would quiet down, that perhaps desire could drown out doubt, and so when Sheila reached for him with a hopeful smile, he didn't pull down, rather allowing himself to sink into the familiarity of her grasp, into the warmth that formerly felt like deliverance after times of insulation, and for a transitory moment he nearly believed he could make it work, that he could categorize his passions and choose the path he'd formerly committed to. But as the night strengthened and the room filled with soft murmurs and rumored solace, his mind betrayed him, drifting not to the woman in his arms but to the bone, who had intentionally claimed his heart, and in a moment of unguarded vulnerability, when emotion caught reason, a single name slipped past his lips, Taylor, slightly louder than a breath yet sonorous in its impact, and time sounded to indurate as Sheila strengthened, her body going rigid beneath his hands, her eyes widening with a admixture of unbelief and forming fury. Cleric realized incontinently what he'd done, the color draining from his face as he climbed to correct himself, to contend it was nothing further than a pointless slip of the lingo, a derivate of too numerous exchanges and too little sleep, but Sheila's expression hardened in a way that transferred a bite through him, because she knew the difference between a mistake and a disclosure, and this felt veritably much like the ultimate. She pulled down sluggishly, her silence far more intimidating than any cried blameworthiness, and when she eventually spoke, her voice was eerily calm as she asked him how long Taylor had been living rent-free in his heart, and though Deacon tried to redirect, to play down, to assure her that his marriage was still his precedence, the damage had formally been done, the fragile vision shattered beyond form. Sheila demanded honesty, pressing him with questions he could no longer dodge, and under the weight of her aspect, he admitted what he'd slightly admitted to himself, that his passions for Taylor had grown into commodity deeper than fellowship, commodity he tried desperately to suppress out of respect for his promises and fear of Sheila's response. The concession hung between them like bank after a fire, thick and stifling, and in that moment Sheila felt the sting not just of covetousness but of treason, because she had believed that against all odds, Deacon had chosen her, excrescencies and all, and now she realized that choice might have been embedded in convenience rather than love. Outdoors, swells crashed against the reinforcement in grim meter, mirroring the storm structure inside the house as Sheila's countenance began to crack, her eyes flashing with a dangerous blend of heartache and outrage, and she advised Deacon that if he allowed, he could simply drift toward Taylor without consequences. He was gravely incorrect, because she had fought too hard and offered too important to be cast away. Cleric, torn between guilt and craving, claimed he no way intended to hurt her, that he was still trying to figure out his own heart, but indeed as he spoke he knew that vacillation could be just as cruel as deliberate treason. Meanwhile, ignorant of the emotional explosion unfolding, Taylor set up herself reflecting on her own complicated passions, seeing that commodity implied dallied between her and Deacon during their recent exchanges, a pressure that neither had dared to admit outright, and though she valued their connection, she had no desire to be the catalyst for chaos, especially given Sheila's unpredictable history. As rumors of strain in Deacon and Sheila's marriage began to circulate among those closest to them, the stage was set for battle, because secrets infrequently stay buried for long in Los Angeles, and the verity has a way of surfacing at the most inconvenient moments. Sheila, unintentional to be blindsided again, resolved to keep a close watch on both Cleric and Taylor, her determination hardening into commodity more advised, while Deacon scuffled with the consummation that trying to please everyone might eventually bring him everything, and the name he'd rumored in a moment of weakness came the spark that hovered to enkindle a full-bloated catastrophe. In the days that followed, pressure coddled beneath every commerce, every regard loaded with subtext, and when Sheila eventually brazened Taylor directly, the exchange was charged with subdued hostility, Sheila criminating her of deliberately driving a wedge into her marriage, Taylor calmly asserting that she had no way pursued Cleric and had no intention of coming between hubby and woman. Yet indeed she couldn't deny that feelings had come entangled in ways neither of them anticipated. Cleric set up himself caught in the crossfire, hopeless to help the situation from twisting further, but the more he tried to intervene, the clearer it came that the foundation of his marriage had cracked beyond easy form, because trust, formerly fractured, infrequently returns to its original strength. As whispers spread through their social circle, enterprise boosted about whether Deacon would eventually choose passion, fidelity, or the uncertain pledge of a healthier love, and the slip of a single name in the quiet of a bedroom came representational of a larger verity he could no longer overrun, that the heart cannot be forced into compliance, and pretending else only detainments the ineluctable reckoning. Sheila, scuffling with the binary pain of rejection and demotion, began to question whether fighting for Deacon was worth the emotional risk, yet her pride and fierce attachment made rendition nearly insolvable, setting the stage for dramatic choices that could alter all their lives. While Deacon stood at the crossroads of desire and responsibility, completely apprehensive that whatever decision he made coming would define not only his romantic future, but his integrity as a man seeking to rise above his once miscalculations. And so the fallout from that rumored name continued to ripple outward, reshaping alliances, exposing vulnerabilities, and reminding everyone involved that in matters of love, indeed a single unguarded word can change everything, leaving the bold and the beautiful poised on the point of another indelible chapter where passion collides with consequence and no bone emerges untouched. As the fragile calm inside the sand house shattered beyond form, Deacon Sharp realized that one rumored name had exposed a verity he'd spent months trying to overrun, and though he tried to undergird himself in the fate, the look in Sheila's eyes told him that commodity abecedarian between them had shifted, commodity that couldn't be smoothed over with justifications or pretenses. She stood near the window, arms wrapped around herself not in weakness but in restraint, as though physically containing the swell of feelings hanging to erupt, and when she eventually turned back to him, the vulnerability she formerly allowed him to see had been replaced with a cool, logical light that made his stomach drop, because if there was one thing more dangerous than Sheila maddened, it was Sheila allowing, calculating, drawing conclusions. Cleric followed her across the room, averring that he hadn't meant to hurt her, that loneliness and confusion had tangled his studies. But she cut him off with a sharp memorial that people infrequently say the wrong name in moments when their guard is down, that the heart speaks most actually when defenses fall, and in that quiet blameworthiness he heard the echo of his own guilt. He tried again to frame it as stress, as emotional load, yet indeed as he spoke he knew the explanation sounded concave, because the image of Taylor's steady smile had indeed been what filled his mind in recent weeks, her calm presence a stark discrepancy to the constant volatility that had defined so much of his life, and that discrepancy had begun to feel less like treason and more like craving for peace. Sheila paced the length of the room, replaying every recent commerce in her mind, the nights he'd claimed prostration, the distracted way he'd checked his phone, the wimpiness in his voice whenever Taylor's name came up in discussion, and she felt demotion burn hotter than wrathfulness, because she flattered herself on reading people, on anticipating treason before it struck, and yet ever she had missed the shift passing under her own roof. When she brazened him again, her voice pulsing not from fear but from the weight of being blindsided, she demanded to know whether he'd ever truly chosen her or if she had simply been the safest option at the time, a question that pierced Cleric deeper than any cried personality, because he'd believed his commitment to Sheila was real, had believed that participated history and collective redemption could anchor them, but now he was forced to defy the possibility that love erected on survival might not repel the appearance of commodity gentler and more aspirational. Outdoors, the megacity continued its indifferent meter, ignorant that another storm was brewing in a relationship formerly fragile from times of public scrutiny and private demons, and as dawn crept through the curtains, casting pale light across their exhausted faces, it came clear that neither of them had slept, neither willing to surrender to rest while the verity hung undetermined between them. In the days that followed, pressure manifested in subtle but unmistakable ways, exchanges cropped and guarded, participated spaces feeling suddenly strange, and though they maintained appearances in public, indeed casual spectators tasted the strain, whispers circulating that maybe the passionate union between Deacon and Sheila had eventually reached its breaking point. Taylor, meanwhile, set up herself decreasingly uncomfortable with the turnabout of hostility she felt whenever she crossed paths with Sheila, a pressure that sounded to joggle beneath polite exchanges, and though she had no intention of pursuing Cleric, she couldn't ignore the connection that had formed through participated vulnerability and honest exchanges about growth and responsibility, a connection that felt embedded not in chaos but in collective respect. She scuffled intimately with the knowledge that her presence might be aggravating an formerly unpredictable situation, questioning whether stepping back entirely would be the most responsible course of action. Yet she also honored that denying her own passions would not abolish them, only bury them deeper. Deacon tried to regain his marriage by redoubling his sweats at consolation, planning small gestures meant to gesture devotion, yet each attempt felt forced, as though he were performing a part rather than living genuinely, and Sheila tasted the difference incontinently, interpreting his renewed alertness not as love but as damage control. The more he tried to move her that they could move past the incident, the further she fixated on the rawness of that moment, on the way his voice had softened when he said Taylor's name, a detail she replayed like a recording she couldn't turn off. Ultimately the stewing pressure erupted into a battle that left both of them emotionally exposed, Sheila criminating him of emotional infidelity, of allowing another woman to enthrall space in his heart while pretending to be completely present in their marriage, and Deacon, sick of denial, eventually admitting that he'd been confused for longer than he watched to admit, that he'd hoped the passions would fade if ignored, but rather they had boosted. That concession marked a turning point because, formerly spoken audibly, the possibility of a future piecemeal came palpable, no longer a distant trouble but a brewing reality. News of the strain inescapably reached their extended circle, sparking concern and enterprise, some siding with Sheila out of fidelity and recognition of her long struggle for acceptance, others still admitting that Deacon's pursuit of a calmer, healthier cooperation might represent genuine growth rather than treason. Taylor, caught in the crosshairs of gossip, brazened Deacon directly, averring that he demanded to resolve his marriage before indeed entertaining the notion of anything differently, her firm boundary a memorial that integrity signified further than impulse, and her turn down to come the other woman only strengthened his admiration for her. Sheila still interpreted their discussion, still innocent, as farther evidence that she was being edged out, and her fear of abandonment began to transubstantiate into resoluteness, not inescapably to avenge but to cover herself from farther demotion. She demanded clarity, a definitive answer about whether he intended to fight for their marriage or pursue the passions he'd inadvertently revealed, and Cleric set up himself standing at an emotional crossroads he could no longer defer, fating that vacillation itself had come its own form of atrocity. In quiet moments alone, he reflected on the line of his life, on the miscalculations that had formerly defined him and the redemption he'd worked lifelessly to achieve, questioning whether adhering to a marriage out of obligation would undermine that growth, yet inversely apprehensive that walking down would induce pain on a woman who had believed in him when many others did. The ripple goods of that single rumored name continued to expand, reshaping alliances, testing commitment, and forcing each of them to defy uncomfortable trueness about desire, responsibility, and the cost of honesty. As weeks passed, the facade of normality grew decreasingly unsustainable, climaxing in a final, emotionally charged discussion in which Sheila conceded that she merited a mate whose heart was completely present, not divided by undetermined craving, and though the admission bring her pride, it also marked a rare moment of tone mindfulness that surprised indeed her. Cleric, hearing the earthquake beneath her composed surface, understood that whatever history they participated couldn't substitute for the authenticity both of them claimed to seek, and though the path forward remained uncertain, one thing was inarguable: the fragile equilibrium of their marriage had been irrevocably altered by the verity he could no longer deny. And so the saga unfolded with the kind of layered intensity that defines enduring drama, each character scuffling not with imitated ill or simplistic heroism but with the messy, deeply mortal reality of clashing feelings, where love is neither pure nor predictable, and a single slip of the lingo can illuminate the retired fractures in indeed the most passionate union, setting the stage for choices that will echo far beyond the confines of one indelible night. In the fate of their painful reckoning, the atmosphere between Deacon and Sheila shifted from explosive to eerily restrained, as though both understood that crying would only mask the deeper crack that had formerly been exposed. Rather, they moved around each other cautiously, each discussion measured, every regard loaded with the knowledge that commodity essential had been lost, and Deacon began to realize that staying out of guilt would eventually breed resentment, a slow corrosion, far more destructive than one honest separation. He set up himself reflecting not only on his passions for Taylor but on what those passions represented: stability, emotional safety, a cooperation erected on responsibility rather than adrenaline, and that consummation forced him to defy the uncomfortable verity that growth occasionally means outgrowing situations that formerly felt like deliverance. Sheila, for her part, oscillated between wrathfulness and soul-searching, fating that while she could demand fidelity, she couldn't command love. And the more she examined her own heart, the further she conceded that she merited someone whose devotion was spontaneous rather than negotiated. When they eventually sat down for what felt like a decisive discussion, there were no theatrics, no dramatic duns, just a participated understanding that the marriage had been erected on participated survival rather than participated serenity. And though neither wanted to label it a failure, they could no longer pretend it was thriving. Deacon admitted that the slip of Taylor's name hadn't been arbitrary but reflective of undetermined emotion, and Sheila, though visibly wounded, surprised him by responding with a quiet strength, stating that she'd not contend for a man's heart, especially not when that heart was formerly leaning away. the exchange marked a turning point, not in bitterness but in bittersweet clarity. And as they contemplated what separation might look like, both felt the weight of history pressing against the possibility of change.